Good evening and welcome to Reproaction's Act and Learn webinar, the first of the year and the decade, January 16, 2020. Tonight we're going to discuss an important and all-encompassing topic. That is sexism in the anti-abortion movement. So first we'll introduce ourselves. We are the co-founders and co-directors of Reproaction this evening. The first voice you're hearing is myself. I'm Erin Matson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in Arlington, Virginia, and I am Erin to the max on Twitter.
And I am Pamela Merritt. My pronouns are she, based in St. Louis. Follow me on Twitter at SharkFoo.
Great. So a quick run of show. We will introduce Reproaction, talk about sexism and the anti-abortion movement, and then move into our panel discussion. We have three fabulous panelists: Dazon, Dixon, Diallo, who is founder and president of SisterLove; Jessica Reaves, who is the editorial director for the Center on Extremism at ADL; and Mike Scheinberg, who is the board organizer with the Washington Area Clinic Defense Task Force. Then we'll go through next steps and Q&A. A few housekeeping matters. You are welcome and encouraged to tweet through this webinar if you would like. We ask that you do so under the hashtag Reproaction. Additionally, if you have questions at any point during the webinar, we encourage you to put them into the chat box. We'll get to as many of them as possible in the Q&A section at the end. You don't have to wait until the end to type them in. So if one of the panelists says something and you have questions, feel free to type it in. We'll get to it at the end. Great. So a bit about Reproaction. Who is this organization? We lead bold, direct action to increase access to abortion and advance justice. We're fiercely proud of our left flank analysis, and we're known for our willingness to hold folks on all sides of the issues accountable, whether they are traditionally considered allies or opposition. And we have a deep commitment to nonviolent direct action as one of the tools in our toolbox. So let's talk about gender equality and access to abortion. These two things, like the two dogs you see on the screen, you really know that access to abortion is important for equality and justice for all people, just as gender equality necessarily includes access to abortion. And knowing about our bodies and having uncontested power over our bodies is critical to the struggle for gender equality and social justice. And access to abortion and family planning is especially critical in struggles to eliminate discrimination. So the reason why we're here tonight is really to talk about the underpinning ideology of the abortion movement. And we know that sexism and racism underpins what it means to be pro-life and that agenda that they are working toward. Specifically, restrictions on abortion seek to enforce and increase white male dominance through a number of things, primarily enshrining rigid gender roles into culture and the law, through state control and social shaming of reproduction and sexuality, particularly for bodies that are not given as white males, and compelling the birth of more white babies while casting suspicion upon women of color and leaving their babies to die. So this is a deeply sexist, racist movement, and we need to remember that that is really what they are driving towards in this push to restrict access to abortion, family planning, and to insert lies into education about how our bodies work. Now, one thing that's very important to note is that the sexism of the anti-abortion movement is race neutral. And in fact, there is a profound anti-Black tone to the sexism of the anti-abortion movement, and also anti-AAPI or Asian American Pacific Islander women. We have seen repeatedly at the federal level, as well as in various states, introduction of abortion bans that single out Asian American Pacific Islander women specifically for additional scrutiny and suspicion, as well as other bans that single out Black women for additional scrutiny and suspicion when seeking reproductive health care. In addition, the anti-abortion movement put up billboards targeting Black women. Here is an example of one of those billboards, and shortly by our first panelist, Dazon, Dixon, Diallo, who will talk about organizing a conference on the ground to these billboards. But I wanted to acknowledge that up front. Another piece that I wanted to touch on before we get to our panelists is Reproaction has been basically since the time of our inception, we have led a really strong campaign to hold state clinics accountable for the harm that they are causing communities around the country. And we do this by holding our trademark direct actions outside of state clinics. We do this through education and awareness, through webinars. We've held multiple webinars on them in our blog. And one of the things that we do, a clinic database that's available on our website that is an independently verified listing of all the state clinics in the United States. Lift this up in the context of this discussion because sexism is an important part of the anti-abortion movement, and these fake clinics are a key part of their strategy in trying to reach what they call pro-woman. And they do this often by using names for their anti-abortion fake clinics. They use names such as a woman's choice, words like that often exist. And they do this purposely because that makes it sound like they're real reproductive health care providers. Because they want to lure people in the door so they can mislead and shame them and talk them out of having the abortions that they are looking for. I want to note that while anti-abortion state clinics may use language that seems to show a girl power attitude or a pro-woman attitude, they often cloak themselves as if they are mothering or holding non-judgmental views of women's sexuality. They only praise and really respect women's power if women wield it in the way that conservatives want them to. And so the ultimate goal is to mislead and shame people seeking abortion care, and it's deeply underpinned by these sexist and racist ideologies that they hold. Important to lift up in this discussion is that anti-trans bigotry is of the sexism of the anti-abortion movement, which if you follow these folks on Twitter, you'll see that these days they are sharing their anti-trans vitriol at a strong pace with their anti-abortion lies and shaming. And I want to be clear that the anti-abortion movement at its core is fundamentally opposed to the equal participation of women, including cisgender and transgender women, and transgender people in public life. And that is what these restrictions and shaming. One way that the anti-abortion movement more recently has tried to rebrand itself as pro-woman or even feminist, which is just not possible. You can't be, there's no such thing as a pro-life feminist. You can't oppose someone being able to self-determine and at the same time support equality. But one way they try to do this is by falsely claiming that trans equality is a threat to those people that they will, when in fact restrictions on the basis of gender hurt everyone. The pro-life movement frequently harasses, misgenders, and spreads misinformation about trans people, including people who have abortions and give birth who are trans. Which is a good seg because to the next topic which is so-called pro-life opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. So as a Virginian and a lifelong feminist, I'm very excited to report that yesterday Virginia became the 38th state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. There are 38 required, in order to bring in a new amendment to the Constitution. And while this matter will go next to the courts, because we know that conservatives will challenge it, the fact is amendments to the Constitution have many times taken hundreds of years, and this has not taken nearly so long. But I want to lift up that abortion opponents have been the most visible opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment in most recent times, and they're blatantly showing their true colors as sexist. And they do this because they understand that gender equality under the law is a real threat to restrictions on the right to abortion. So I want to underpin that the Equal Rights Amendment is a fabulous step toward equality. It's not a be-all, end-all. There's still more work to do. But I want to lift up that the anti-abortion movement, we can expect that they're going to be spreading a lot of misinformation about this amendment. Know that this amendment is important. Of course, gender equality and abortion rights go together. And also be prepared that what they have been saying has included a lot of vile anti-trans rhetoric, and we can expect that to increase. So a few other things, and then we'll get to our panelists. I wanted to share some wave tops from a recent poll done by the group called Perry Undum. The name of this poll was the State of the Union on Gender Equality Rights. So there is a minority in this country who does want to see Roe v. Wade overturned, the decision that the Supreme Court decision that affirms the federal constitutional right to abortion. And of this narrow minority that wants to see that federal constitutional right to abortion overturned, 2 out of 3 of them agree that they are, quote, more comfortable with women having traditional roles in society, such as caring for children or the family, unquote. 2/3 of them also agree, quote, male politicians can represent the interests of women as well as female politicians can. And nearly 2/3 of those polled disagreed with the statement that, quote, men should not have a say in legislating what women do for their bodies, unquote. And the statistics for the vast majority of voters who do not want to see Roe v. Wade overturned were very, very different, with strong disagreement with this idea of women, with women holding traditional roles, and also wanting to see more women in office and thinking that women in office are better at representing their own interests. Pleased to get us started on our panel discussion. First, we'll welcome Dazon Dixon Diallo, who is founder and president of SisterLove, Inc., established in 1989 as the first women's HIV justice organization in the southeastern United States. Dazon is a recognized visionary and advocate in the struggle for human rights and reproductive justice and the fight against HIV/AIDS, communities of women and girls living with HIV and those at risk for HIV and STIs. She's a proud member of In Our Own Voice National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda and is based in Atlanta, Georgia. Dazon, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, excited for this chat. So let's dive right in. So you founded SisterLove, Inc., which is the first women's HIV, AIDS, and reproductive justice organization in the southeastern U.S. Please tell us a bit about your work.
Sure, and thanks for asking. So SisterLove, yes, we are now 30 years old, a sexual and reproductive justice organization based in Atlanta and also 20 years now in Johannesburg in South Africa. And we're a pretty comprehensive organization in the sense that we do service delivery as well as policy and advocacy work, as well as we're a pretty savvy convener now, and we also do a lot of community-led research. So across the spectrum of focusing in and access to care, as well as making sure we're supporting and championing the agency of women to make decisions, women and in all our diversities, that is, women and girls, as well as our trans family members, to make autonomous and self-determining decisions about their health and well-being regarding their sexual health.
Thank you very much. We're, again, thrilled to have you tonight. Refer back to something earlier in the presentation. That is that anti-abortion billboards ran in the South, and for that matter, also in Times Square in New York City, with an offensive claim that the most dangerous place for a Black baby is in the womb. And you were on the front lines of the response to those billboards. If you could please share your thoughts on how those billboards reveal the pronounced sexism and racism the anti-abortion movement reserved for Black women specifically, and then secondarily, also what you did on the ground to organize a response to these billboards.
Sure. So, and I'll just, because we didn't have a whole lot of time to talk about it, but it's really weird that when I mentioned to people, okay, yeah, we're going to be doing this webinar and it's on sexism and the anti-abortion movement, and I'm sure that as you all were promoting this conversation, that you probably got some of the same feedback, is like, well, isn't that sort of the core element of what anti-abortion means, is that it's sexist, and why do we need to have a conversation about it? And I had some of the same thought, but it made me also think a little deeper about how we articulate these issues as taking them outside of the box of people who are anti-abortion, who also call themselves pro-life, as if that is a moniker that means something to them, because it doesn't at the end of the day, given the other issues that they similarly support that don't support life. But what it also means is that if we don't give analysis to this, then it's harder for us to spread and grow our movement. And so I'm really appreciating the conversation. So having said that, when we're talking about specifically the billboard campaign, as much as we talk about how sexist and racist it was, is that it was also way too easy and lazy a target, right? So by choosing Black women to target in this specific way around abortion, I think was just a lazy way of advancing their own politics and their own movement. And I say that because Black women are already the easiest target for anything around agency and power and self-determination and our sex and sexuality and our reproduction. And we're the easiest and target, I think, is because we have the least access to health care. We have the least access in terms of coverage for abortions when we need them. We have also seen time and time again that we also don't have equal access to health information, education, prenatal care, and also postnatal care when we choose to have. You know, we're looking at having the highest rates of maternal mortality and infant morbidity and all kinds of things going on. And so, again, anytime we're targeting Black women around our ability to control our lives, I just think it's a lazy effort. It was also keen to us at the time that when we figured out who was posting and paying for the billboard, it also came along with challenging us inside our own community around the sexism in the Black community, because it was predominantly Black people who championed these campaigns in Georgia. It was a Black woman as well who was a conservative and a Republican wanting to be an elected official in the state of Georgia, and a Black man who used a lot of misogyny, that experience, these billboards. So there's something that we haven't talked about, is the role that those billboards played in dividing the community based on the sexism that we're already dealing with inside the Black community and Black families and just the Black spaces. The other thing that challenges us to give analysis around the sexism in the campaign is that it is also about pitting. There's nothing, it has not escaped us that at the deepest levels, a large part of the anti-abortion movement and the campaign, which is predominantly led by, named by, and coined by white men, so-called heterosexual, is because their own legacy and their progeny are dwindling. There's a zero birth rate among white people, not just in the United States, but across the globe. And to control ability and control white women's ability to control their own pregnancies is really, really, really the end game at the end of the day. It really isn't about caring for Black children when they get here. It really isn't about paying attention to Black lives at all, the women or otherwise. And so the sexism in an anti-abortion campaign that targets Black women is really, really, really targeting white women. And I say that in the context that the people who want to get the message across would not succeed with those kinds of messages with images of white babies and white toddlers in white neighborhoods. It would have to be against Black and brown women with the images of Black and brown babies and toddlers in Black and brown neighborhoods to affect a larger conversation that looks primary target. I don't think we've talked about also what that really means in terms of building justice movement. If even the white women who were our allies in the fight against these billboards actually did not see that these billboard campaigns actually had them in mind, even if they weren't the actual target. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that clearly made sense to us. The fact that they used Black anti-abortion groups to propagate these billboards says exactly the same thing about their racist approach. It wasn't the National Right to Life. It wasn't the Operation Rescue type campaigns. It wasn't those bigger, more predominantly white are traditionally seen in the anti-abortion activist space. Younger, Black-led, Black-run institutions or organizations that were led by Black men, for whom they used boards together. And I'm not confused that these organizations led by Black men were not used, because we know where the money came from, which was not within Black anti-abortion supporters or communities. So, you know, that I know I have a follow-up question that I might be answering already, but those really are the core elements. And mainly the way we organized to bring them down was we brought those very things to light, that for Black women, the blaming and the shaming of our bodies and of our decisions and of how we live in our communities was enough to anger and mobilize people to make calls, to go after the billboard companies themselves, to sue them because they were also not giving us equal opportunity to buy billboards and produce counter messaging. And we spread it nationally so that when other billboards started popping up, it did not take as long to take them down.
Thank you for that. 2 more minutes before our next panelist. So if you could just share a bit more on your thoughts on how others on this call, we do have primarily an activist audience, can best help fight back, whether it's against things like the billboard or the anti-abortion movement, cynically trying to appropriate civil rights language in order to push its agenda.
Yeah. So that too is a part of being fairly lazy about coming up with their own strategies, their own language, their own messaging that actually meaningfully supports their own ideology. It's about appropriating liberation ideology, which is truly promulgated by progressive communities, by anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-classist, anti-homophobic, anti-xenophobic types of groups and organizations such as our own. So when you see them use campaigns that now begin to talk conversation around genocide, for example, and identifying Black women's choices of abortion as if we are our very own Hitlers, or as if we are acting out what took place in Rwanda, or what's taken place, for example, long years ago in the Khmer Rouge, is that we are being, that those terms are being used to compare us to things that viscerally move people to a different place of hatred and shaming and blaming. And the other part around, really misappropriating terminology as well as ways of organizing that civil rights has done is that they still don't recognize the role of liberation ideology being about affirming people's choices, about affirming people's ability to exist, and that same language to fetuses or to entities that don't yet exist in our space, that don't yet live independently in our space, is exactly the same thing that has been used against the gay community, against the LGBTQ community, against the civil rights movement, even early on, is that we do not, in the white supremacist patriarchal spaces, that we do not have the right to use our own language to define our own movement, and therefore we will crush you with, if as we build our movements appropriately, then people understand the theft that represents, and that they are also not, they're not winning with using our language against our own movements.
Thank you so much. I'm going to encourage everyone to put in any questions they have for Dazon in the chat box, and I'm going to pass it over to Pamela.
Thank you so much, Erin. Our next panelist is Jessica Reaves, who is the Center on Extremism Editorial Director at the Anti-Defamation League. She is an expert in researching and monitoring extremist groups and individuals, and served as an expert consultant to law enforcement agencies on cases involving anti-government extremist groups and white supremacists. A former reporter for Time and Chicago Tribune, Jessica is based in Denver, Colorado. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. So let's dive right in. You have obviously extensive experience tracking and reporting on the men's rights movement. What is the men's rights movement? Who are these people? And where and how do they organize?
Sure. So last year we published a piece that I wrote. It was a report on the intersection of misogyny and white supremacy. You can find it on the ADL website. And the research for that report really took me into some, let's say, dark places, very grim places online. I spent a lot of time researching the manosphere, which is essentially the equivalent of your worst case scenario of men gathering online in various online forums. So the manosphere is made up essentially of 3 different groups. The first and probably most famous are the incels, or involuntary celibates. Another group is the pickup artists, or PUAs, and then the men's rights activists they round out the unholy trio, and they tend to, the men's rights movement grew out of sort of a 1970s response to second wave feminism. And, it initially was something that, men would get involved with because they were worried about fathers' rights, quote unquote, or, women gaining too much power in the workplace. So it started as something that was as a response to feminism, but it has become something much more extreme in recent years. And one of the things that I found out in researching this report is the extent to which all 3 of these parts of the manosphere are fully infected by various white supremacist ideologies. You know, so you have the full range of horribleness from, you know, people preaching violent and encouraging violent misogyny, people spreading conspiracy theories about Jews controlling the world. And then you also have people raging against, you know, Black women having agency over their bodies. Mm-hmm. So there's a really robust and very dangerous sort of synergy going on, especially in these online spaces. We know that white supremacists gather online. We know that they find a lot of common cause in these chat rooms. What we didn't necessarily realize until we really started to dig was the extent to which they were poisoning other extremists with their specific ideologies.
Got it. Thank you for that. And that leads to my second question, which is, obviously, as you mentioned, there's a lot of common threads between the anti-abortion movement, the men's rights movement. As somebody who is based in Missouri, we're very familiar with the Christian identity movement, right, and how it intersects with both of those. But what goals do you see these movements sharing in common, and how do they overlap and intersect?
I mean, you know, first and foremost is the idea that women are less than, women do not deserve bodily agency, women can't make their own decisions, women need to be helped at all times. This incredibly patriarchal, condescending idea of what women need and want. And, you know, in the white supremacist world, we see this taken to another extreme, which you do often see in the men's rights activist world, but dialed down a bit. The white supremacist version of this is white women need to be staying at home and producing as many white warrior babies as possible. They need to be providing a nice home for their man, and they need to be making sure that all of his needs are met before they take on any sort of external goals or certainly any kind of job. Their first responsibility is to their house and their family and their man. But the focus on the white warrior babies is notable, I think, because we, you know, as Dazon mentioned, you know, there's this whole idea of the Great Replacement, which I'm sure you've heard of at this point, but this idea that white people are being replaced by non-white people, and this sparks great fear in the hearts of the white supremacists. And so their goal is to try to procreate as frequently as possible to try to counteract this sociological shift. And, you know, they're willing to obviously go to great extremes to make sure that this is reversed. But for the men's rights activists and the PUAs and the sort of the guys on the manosphere, they view women, I think, with a combination of fear and loathing, you know, to borrow a phrase. There's a sense that if we let women get too much power, that's dangerous for everybody because they can't handle it and we don't want to deal with it. But there's also this sense that, you know, women don't know what's best for them, so we need to control everything about their lives.
Wow. Whew, thank you for that. So my final question is that we've obviously seen an uptick in extremist violence, aided and overtly abetted by communities on the internet, as well as the White House, from anti-abortion terrorists to anti-Semitic attackers, white nationalists, and men's rights activists, and all too often culminating in mass shootings. To what extent do you see gender oppression and reproductive oppression as core to these violent ideologies?
So the reproductive oppression is critical. I wrote a piece last year analyzing white supremacist response to the Alabama abortion bans that were passed by the legislature anyway in May of 2019. And the white supremacist response to the bans was really, you know, I think illuminating. they had mixed feelings about it. They wanted non-white women to have easy and frequent access to abortion, and they wanted white women not to have access to abortion. So I know this mirrors a lot of what has been said previously in this webinar. So, but just the extent to which this sort of, both the racism and the misogyny and the sexism are codified in the language that white supremacists use to talk about women based on their race. And it is truly horrifying. But I think that because, you know, this, I'm not going to surprise anyone if I reveal, everyone here knows that this country was founded on profound racism and profound sexism. And that continues to this day. That is what our laws are based on. That's what our entire system functions on. And so I think people who are, you know, using those laws today know very well that they are, you know, working with 200 years of history backing them up. That is not to say that, you know, we can't change things, because that's, you know, that's the only way forward, is to shake the foundations and move towards something more just and equitable for everyone.
Yes, thank you. I'm speechless, and that never happens. Thank you so much, Jessica. If you'll hold on, we will have Q&A at the end. Sure. And if you do have questions for Jessica or for Dazon or Mike, who's coming up, please drop them in the question tab on your GoToWebinar control panel. And with that, I'll hand it over to Erin.
Thank you, Pamela. So, and thank you, Jessica. So next, I am pleased to introduce Mike Scheinberg, our final panelist this evening, who is board organizer for the Washington Area Clinic Defense Task Force, an all-volunteer nonviolent group founded in the 1980s to promote peaceful and safe access to reproductive health clinics in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. He's a clinic escort working to ensure a peaceful and reassuring presence for patients, their companions, and staff at several local clinics, and is based in Alexandria, Virginia. And I have to say, as a point of personal privilege, that this photograph is just awesome to me, and I love it. So we protested, Reproaction has protested the anti-abortion group Susan B. Anthony list, what they call their Gala for Life, on multiple years. And this most recent year, we had a Stop Prosecuting Abortion protest outside their gala to protest their callousness about the very real reality that women and people who can become pregnant are going to jail for ending their own pregnancies in the United States. And Mike puts together the most awesome signs, and this like Susan B. an inmate with their image or their logo is everything. So anyway, thank you, Mike, and thank you for joining us tonight. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you for having me and for having probably the best picture out of everybody. No offense to the other panelists. But yeah, did you want to ask the question, or do you want me to just go into what exactly I do?
Yeah, I can ask you, so folks
Sure.
can follow along. So first, if you could tell us about your work on the Washington Area Clinic Defense Task Force and why you decided to get involved.
Sure. Basically, clinic escorting or clinic defense, it has a few different flavors to it, but the primary objective is pretty universal, to help patients and companions access the clinic while minimizing exposure to harassment by anti-choice protesters. In terms of how I got involved, many clinic escorts have stories about how they grew up ultra-religious, and then they eventually were able to open their a little bit later and then do a 180. I do not have that experience. I grew up in a very liberal Jewish household with very progressive values. And I remember that at around 8 or 9, I saw an envelope on the kitchen table to Planned Parenthood because my parents were making a donation to it. And I asked my mom straight out, what is Planned Parenthood? Because I thought that it kind of sounded silly. And my mom told me everything, and probably more so than I needed to know at that time. But we really started a great dialogue about sexuality, about sexual orientation, about all these different types of things that I really hadn't had that opportunity and that experience before. So I felt that I did have that progressive background with it. When I was in college in the 90s, I saw an article about clinic escorting in the local area. And I talked to my mom about that and said, you know, this is great. And we had a wonderful conversation, but she said, this is not for you. This is very dangerous. My mom died relatively young, a little over a decade ago. And around the same time, I saw another article about a group in Kentucky doing this at the one remaining abortion clinic in Louisville, Kentucky. I sarcastically said, well, my mom certainly can't stop me now, but I looked online. WACTF, Washington Area Clinic Defense Task Force, was the clinic escorting option in my area, so I got involved. And it was originally different than I imagined. Maybe I thought that it was taking somebody through a sea of people, but I quickly learned that at least here, it was more about advocating for patients to come in. It's more about making sure that they feel comfortable being able to access that clinic itself. So what I do is I started clinic escorting in DC. I've been a clinic escort in a couple different areas in the DC area. I've also had the opportunity to visit other clinic escorts in different states, in about 12 different states in DC, to be able to see what the environments are like over there as well.
That's awesome. So, so with all this work on the front lines, there's no question that you're quite familiar with the harassing signs and shouts anti-abortion protesters direct toward people entering reproductive health care facilities. And can you provide some examples of what you've heard and seen outside clinics? And just in particular, do you notice that sexism and racism and what is shouted at people?
The word Jezebel is something which has started to really come into tune a lot. So sometimes the sexism is that overt. And you might hear people saying Jezebel. There are men who are yelling this as well. You see the protesters also focus on the things that they say, on the most part, to women who are clinic escorts. There have been escorts who I know who have been followed home, who have been intimidated, their license plates have been written down. And I think that part of it is that some of these protesters really have an opportunity to talk at women. Perhaps that's because they feel that this is something that they feel women are making a big mistake about, that this is about women's sexuality, and they feel that they make assumptions about women's sexual promiscuity. So not only are they making assumptions about patients who are coming in, but it's also the escorts there who I think that they feel are an audience there. Erin had mentioned anti-trans vitriol, which we've also seen as well. There are trans escorts who have been targeted and explicitly misgendered and dead named as well. But some of the sexism we see is a little bit more subtle. It's taking a look at the leadership and attitudes and techniques used by protesters. And while there certainly are women who are vocal in front of the clinics, on the most part, it's really vocal leadership by the men, and really the anger by the men in this case, the way that they're speaking very emotionally. This past summer, I had the opportunity to observe the Operation Safe America conference in Milwaukee. And I happened to get invited to one of their prayer rallies after one of their days of action, which in itself is a bizarre experience. But seeing this hybrid prayer service and debriefing, with very few exceptions, with men who were up front, women sang, and there were congratulations about the engagement of one of the young women there. But one item that really sticks out was a participant who was talking about his experiences that day and his interaction with the police. When he mentioned then the cop came, a lady cop, and then the stickering of the room was, wow. But there's also sexism among the women who are anti-choice protesters as well, because women who make assumptions that their experiences and their goals are universal, and there's something wrong with other women, whether they be clinic escorts or whether they be patients who decide to make different decisions too. So there's really a lot of different things out there. We do see in one situation which we saw in Raleigh, North Carolina, for example, is people who were targeting and trying to count the number of people by race in terms of who is entering that clinic too. So we certainly do see that sexism, we do see that racism. They do not see it that way. They see it as saving. And they see it as, well, you see, this is what we're doing. We're the racist ones. But what they're doing in this case is they're really making assumptions that their way of life and the way that they see things should be the way that everybody sees things. That in itself is very sexist and racist in their environments and attitudes.
Thank you for that. So we've got about one more minute, and then we'll close up with next steps and do Q&A. But I did really want to ask you, and I'm excited that you joined this panel this evening. It's great to have a man on the panel discussing this. So there's a trope that abortion is a women's issue when we know that access to reproductive health care is critical for equality and justice for people of all genders. My question to you, as someone who does this work, would you like to see more men doing this work, and how would you suggest other men get started?
So the short answer is yes. When there's more cisgender men involved, one reason is that when you see protesters who are outside the clinics, usually they will calm down a little bit when they see other cisgender men. It's not always the case, but it's something which a lot of people will see there, that sometimes they see somebody who looks more familiar to them and they'll quiet down. But I think more importantly, it's because that there will be men all over the place who are going to be dismissive of women or trans folks, and we need men who will call other men out, and that's really being an advocate there. It's very easy to get caught up in groupthink and to not say something, but being able to have men who are advocating something is really important. I think before men become involved at all, the first thing what you need to do is really acknowledge that privilege. We as men do not have the same experiences, for example, driving to and from a clinic that women do. Our voices will be heard far more frequently. When we have our own medical visits, we'll likely be treated better and trusted more than those who are not cisgender men. And something else to keep in mind too is that sexism still does exist within, while it's in the anti-abortion community, of course, it still has the potential to exist, and sometimes does exist within our camp. And we have to make sure that we're not just dismissing it, saying we're on the same side. Even if we're doing it subconsciously, we need to make sure that we're calling each other out. We need to make sure that we are constantly reevaluating, and that we're able to hear and trust and listen to amplified voices that we don't usually hear, rather than making our own assumptions saying we're doing the right thing. So getting easy is easy as supporting advocacy organizations. I happen to like abortion funds because they always need their money and support. It's about volunteering, donating, of course, but also letting your other male friends know that you're doing this and that it's okay to do this. And the advocacy is not hands-off for men, but once you get involved, it's about experiencing leadership and voices that are not just men. So it's really a very big listening experience to those people who you might not necessarily listen to, or that men don't necessarily listen to on a regular basis here. Clinic escorting is great. It's not for everyone, but really asking how you can best help from people who are really in the movement itself, I think, is really the most important part. As Jessica said, our country was founded on racism and sexism, and our way forward really is to help repair that. And in terms of being men and being able to call people out, I think that in itself is really paramount, and being an advocate is really paramount as well.
Thank you. I want to encourage folks to drop any questions you have for Mike in the question box, and just a bit of housekeeping. So we do these Act and Learn webinars every single month. They're free, they're open to the public, and they're designed to dig deeper into topics, get you more educated, and whether it's ready to have a disagreement with your uncle that's productive, or get you the latest direct action tips and strategies that'll make you a more effective activist, or just to learn more about topics. We do that. We host direct actions in a variety of communities around the country on a regular basis, and have online petitions. So don't miss any of this. Sign up for alerts at www.reproaction.org. You can do that on their website, upper right corner, sign up for alerts, and then you won't miss a thing. I also want to lift up that there's a great blog post from our senior campaign lead, Shireen Shakori, on the fake clinics and misogyny front. And if you go on our website, we have a blog. One of her great posts is, "Who is surprised a fake clinic operator is misrepresenting feminism too?" And then I also want to encourage you to follow us on social media. We are Reproaction on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I also would like to encourage you to save the date. Our next webinar for February will be on Wednesday, February 26th at the same time, 7 p.m. Eastern. And we're going to be talking about marijuana legalization and reproductive oppression. So it'll be a really timely and important topic. We've seen a number of states legalize marijuana. We've also seen a number of pregnant people being targeted while marijuana has been legalized. So important topic, and we're looking forward to discussing it. And with that, I will pass it back to my co-director, Pamela, to lead us through Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Erin. We have a ton of questions, so let's dive right in. We'll try to get through as many of them as possible. The first question is, I'm going to give this one Dazon first, and then others can weigh in. But one of the question is that one of the anti-choice messages that this attendee has witnessed a lot when volunteering as an escort at Planned Parenthood was the racist roots of the organization, particularly the intentions or alleged intentions of Margaret Sanger. How do you suggest pro-choice advocates respond to that messaging? Dazon, I'm going to unmute you. Are you there? Dazon, did we lose you?
I'm here. I think did you unmute me now? Yeah, you got me. Okay.
Yep.
So this is one of my favorite questions that no longer challenges me, because I believe that there's the most important way to respond to that is, and it's sort of the way you kind of started out this whole conversation. And that is, well, if we want to hold, for example, and this is usually unique to Planned Parenthood. So if we want to hold Planned Parenthood responsible in 2020 for attitudes that were about the culture and the social environment for Margaret Sanger and her ilk in the early part of the 20th century, then we would hold that same expectation to the roots of this whole country. And we know that this country has evolved, that people have evolved in this country. How we identify who we are as Americans today is not how we would identify as Americans in 1776. And I would apply that same thinking to how we would think about a reproductive rights organization in 2020 versus where they were in the early part of the 20th century. That's the first thing. The second part of it is, and I would just leave it right there, because I think that's the most important thing, is that how we started was still rooted in women's agency. It was still rooted in understanding the role that contraception played. And the fact that one of the persons or the woman who founded it also lived in a very racist, segregationist time does not negate that her own vision for a future of women's liberation should not still be realized.
Hear, hear. Thank you for that. Jessica or Mike, did you want to weigh in before we move on?
Mike, I think that one thing also to keep in mind here, and I really like Dazon's answer there, we're not going to, a lot of the time, we're not going to convince people who are really out there calling these things out. So I think a lot of it really has to do with educating those folks who are around us to be able to say, this is what that argument is. But really having the argument sometimes with some of the folks who are really on the line there is really not going to be the best productive use of our time. But I think that it's important to realize that this is certainly an argument that's being made, a claim that's being made, though, by anti-choice protesters.
Thank you so much for that. The next question is going to be for Jessica, and then the other panelists can weigh in. What advice would you have for someone who personally comes across a white supremacist? I'm assuming either online or in the real world.
Well, I think, yes, depending on whether it is real life or online, I think you have very different options. In the real world, if you are confident that they are in fact a white supremacist, I would remove myself from the situation as quickly as possible. Online, you have a much better chance of, theoretically at least, engaging in some sort of conversation. Generally speaking, we talk a lot about in this country about how it's, when people are really set in their ways, it's very difficult to move them one way or the other to another viewpoint. And I would say that white supremacists are probably the most committed to their ideology among a range of extremists. So I'm not sure there's anything to be gained out of engaging with a white supremacist, unless you get the sense that they are sort of in the early stages of their radicalization, and that they might actually be open to a conversation about moderating their views.
Thank you for that. Dazon, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Jess has actually covered it very well. I just think, yeah, no, I'm just going to leave it at that given our time. I think that was beautifully said.
Thank you. And thank you, Jessica, for that. Next question is for Mike. Is there a group in Raleigh that folks could reach out to for clinic escorting?
I'm trying to think of what their name was. I think that they were the Triangle Women's Coalition, and I'm going to try to find this while I'm doing this now. But yes, there is. I would say if you do a search on abortion Raleigh, you should be able to find that. If I can't find it right now, I would say get in touch with Reproaction. I can certainly pass that name along as well. But they are very active. They're also a fun group. I spent Friendsgiving with him this past around Thanksgiving time. It's really a wonderful group of people who have the same passion and found each other in the Triangle.
Thank you so much for that. Yes, and if you, if the attendee could just send an email to reproaction@reproaction.org, and we can get that information back to you. And then I think the final question, I'm going to put it out to every panelist. We'll start with Jessica. Do you feel that there has been more awareness of sexism in the anti-abortion movement, or of these radical, extremist, and violent views since you began your work, or less?
You know, I think that when I used to be a reporter. When I joined the ADL, I, was very aware of sort of anti-abortion extremism and how that affected clinics nationwide. I think these days, unfortunately, there are so many outrages on a daily basis that, those of us who follow extremism and follow hate are sort of exhausted. So, as we all are, I think, just generally speaking at this point. But so I think that there's probably more awareness, but I'm not sure there's as much energy right now, because I just feel like our energy is being expended in so many different arenas, and it's like sort of trying to hold back, an avalanche of potentially dangerous developments. So that's not a very optimistic answer, but
no, but that's real. That's very real. Thank you so much for that, Dazon.
Yeah, no, I think that I'm not sure if there's more awareness of sexism in the movement, because like I said, I think that people automatically see the movement itself as a sexist enterprise. But I do think that we've gotten to a point where we are able to call it out differently than we've done before. Maybe because there are so many egregious actions that are taking place around the country and in the world. But what I also think is that and of course I have mental pause now, so that thought just went out of my head, and it's a really, really good one. So I'm gonna let Mike finish, and then if it comes back, it's just gonna blurt out like, because it's just gonna come out of my brain really fast when it comes back. But yeah, so if Mike can go ahead and answer that, because it was a really good follow-on to what Jess had just said, especially in the electronic space.
Okay, Mike.
I mean, there's not really as much really there to add. I would say, this is going to sound weird. Give me the question one more time.
Do you feel like there's more awareness of sexism in the anti-abortion movement and of extremism, or less?
Thank you. I think that I think that people who are feeling that there is more extremism with it are becoming more moderate about it. Meaning that the ones who are going to be extremists are still going to think that they're not doing anything wrong, that they're there doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Thank you for that. And Dazon, did the thought come back?
Well, it didn't, but where I know I was going with it is that what I think is problematic is that what I know what it is now. Yes, I do. So there are two things. One is what's problematic is that there are many, many, many women in the anti-abortion movement. And I have come across many not many, but enough disturbingly LGBTQ type folks who are also a part of the anti-abortion language, force, and movement. And to that degree, I think that if you are in the anti-abortion, recognize the sexism that exists within that space. In terms of how the genders are managed and defined and designated inside the movement. But most importantly, what I also think that we don't do is identify the microaggressions and sexist behavior the same way we identify in racist behavior. And so there are ways that I think the awareness is there, but we don't have the language for it to call it out in the same way, because we're not recognizing those microaggressions when they're happening, whether it's in clinic defense or whether it's in the messaging that comes from anti-abortion factions, or whether it's in what they actually represent and when they show up.
That is a word. We're going to end on that note. Jessica, Mike, and Dazon, thank you so much for this amazing and informative webinar. Thank you to Aaron, my co-pilot, Aaron Metzen, for organizing this month's webinar. And thank you, as always, to our attendees for your time tonight. And we will close out the webinar right now, and you can reach us at reproaction.org, Reproaction on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you, and have a fantastic rest of your evening.